Well, yesterday I spent quite a bit of time talking about how that when we come to Christ, there is not only a change of our heart, but there's also a change of the way we live our lives. A simple fact is that Jesus said it's out of the heart that our behaviors really express themselves in the outward world. So that a lot of times when people wonder what defines our behavior, we like to blame it on our genetics. We say that, I inherited these traits, these weaknesses, these characteristics from my relatives. It's kind of like the idea that if I'm Irish and I have red hair, that I automatically have a bad temper. And a bad temper has nothing to do with the color of your hair or your ethnicity. It has to do with the fact that you've been raised in an environment where behaving with angry and violent ways has been permitted and not looked upon as being something that needs to be curbed and controlled. And then secondly, not only we look at things like our genetics, we oftentimes try to blame it on our parents, where we sit back and say, well, the environment that I grew in shaped and formed me, and as a result, I behave poorly. And I think that's true in a sense, that both your genetics and your environment do affect your behavior, in the sense that we also are genetically predisposed to be sinners. And when we grow up in an environment where sinful behavior is often rewarded, as sadly was to some degree in my childhood, then you don't recognize that the things that you're doing are wrong until they turn around and bite you in the face and cause all sorts of hurt and harm. Example in my life certainly was with that. There were certain things my parents told me were really wrong. In other words, I wasn't supposed to lie, cheat, or steal, and that sexual behavior or immorality was almost always wrong, but but not absolutely. So when I grew up, I realized that there were things that sometimes it was all right to lie, sometimes it was all right to cheat, sometimes it was all right to steal. It just depended upon the situation you were in. And we called it a situational ethics, where basically if the situation favored me, then I could give myself permission to do it. After I came to Christ and I started reading the Word, and I realized that lying, cheating, stealing, and sexual immorality were things that were always wrong in the eyes of God. And I needed to own that and to begin to ask God to change those things about me. And I'm not saying it was easy, but it was valuable. Then I realized that most of the negative things that had happened to me in my life up to that point was the fact that I had this kind of situational ethic, where I gave myself permission to do things that only proved to be harmful in the long run. They destroyed more than they ever helped me gain. And so that's why Paul, as he's speaking to us, he talks about, really not living the rest of our lives, that he says, in these evil human desires. He says these are the things that pagans choose to do. Now, short word about the word pagans here. Pagan, it's the Greek word ethnos, and in the Jewish context, ethnos referred to the Gentiles, which was everybody who wasn't Jewish. And the idea of being a pagan meant that you were religious, but you were worshiping the wrong God. The fact of the matter is, everybody is religious. Everybody has some kind of religious faith. Even the atheist is really practicing the religion of atheism, essentially, or agnosticism. They're basically saying, I choose not to believe there's a God in the universe, and therefore that makes me the God of the universe. Or it's also the idea that I don't know if there's a God, so basically I'm just going to live my life pretending that he doesn't exist because I don't want him to be affecting my choices and my decisions. I mean, these are religious decisions that people are making. So everybody has a religion, but the point is, do I have the true religion? And what Peter is saying is there are many people who are following a lifestyle that is contrary to the ways of God. And this was particularly true when talking about the Gentile world, where the worship of various gods was actually involved the way he puts it here is living in debauchery. Now, debauchery is one of those words that we don't use a whole lot today. What it means is literally excessive, unbridled, shameless, insolent indulgence in sensual pleasures. I mean, a person who is debauched is someone who basically says the whole purpose of life is to stimulate my sensual pleasures, and they will not let anything stand in the way. And again, the worship in many of the temples of the ancient world many times became debaucherous, particularly those who worshiped Dionysus, or Bacchus as the Romans called him, which was on display at the opening ceremony of the Olympics in Paris here recently. When they were criticized, the creators were criticized because they said, well, what you've done is insulted Christianity by making a mockery of the Lord's Supper. They said, we weren't talking about the Lord's Supper. We were celebrating Dionysus as if that was better. But essentially, Dionysus and Bacchus were the gods who were worshipped through debauchery. Even the Roman government, at least during the early days, put a handle on this because they said it became so out of control that when they would have these worshiping of they were drunken brawls and orgies that would take place. And that's why he goes on to say that this debauchery leads to lust. And lust here in this context means basically being controlled and driven by a sensual appetite. That's why when we talk about people who are sexually addicted, or even people who become addicted to food or technology and things of that light, that they're saying that people who get can't put their phones down and addicted to gaming and all that sort of stuff are really stimulating toxins in their brain that stimulate them and get them excited and give them a sense of pleasure, and they become disconnected. That's the whole part of, they call pornography is basically stimulating what's called erototoxins, that people become addicted to the pornography because it gives them a feeling of well-being. They said that is as powerful as a shot of heroin for many people. And so this idea that, lust is just a little thing, well, it creates a craving for things oftentimes which are forbidden by God. And so that's why when people start at 12 and 14 years of age and they're viewing pornography, it is not surprising that they continually move forward to more perverted forms of expression. And that's where, thirdly, he talks about drunkenness. Drunkenness is generally intoxication. It literally means excessive drinking of wine, because that was the main intoxicant in the ancient world. But it means intoxication or imbibing of any kind of toxic substance. That's why we call them intoxicants, because they're toxic, that alters your state of consciousness. It basically affects you so that you don't use sound judgment and you make decisions that later on you regret. And every one of us, and I was one of them, who had experiences of becoming intoxicated as a young man, knew that I ended up in places and situations and circumstances that I later regretted. And so I think that, again, this idea that we're allowing ourselves to be controlled by something other than the Holy Spirit. And that's why, fourthly, he adds in orgies, which is excessive self-indulgence. In fact, the Greek word orgia here means really secret rites or revelry. In other words, the idea of sexual intercourse between priestesses and people who were coming to the temples was considered to be part of the expression. In fact, they had both male and female priestesses who were basically what they call them cadmites. They were young boys that were used for the sexual pleasure of men as well as young girls. And many times they were 12, 13, 14 years of age, because by 15 or 16 they were considered over the hill. And they probably were pretty worn out by that point. But the whole idea was that this idea that somehow you worship God through your sensuality is something that he says is an evil human desires. And then he adds on the statement carousing, which carousing we would translate literally as wild, uncontrolled parties. In fact, the word komos here in the Greek literally means, quote, I read from the lexicon, a nocturnal or evening and riotous procession of half-drunken and frolicsome fellows who, after a supper parade through the streets with torches and music in honor of Bacchus or Dionysus or some other deity, and would sing and play before houses of male and female friends, hence used generally of feasts and drinking and parties that are protracted till late at night, and indulge in revelry until they collapse in the morning. I mean, we're talking about what a lot of frat parties are like in colleges around the world. But it's this whole idea of just giving yourself over to sensual indulgences. And then last of all, he says, detestable idolatry, which means that you do this as the worship of false gods, the perverted activities that arise from them. And that's why, if I can just take another moment to go back to the opening ceremony at the Paris Olympics, what was so revealing in all of that was the fact that they were all openly saying, we worship the god of sensuality, which is also referred to as Satan. It doesn't mean that your sensual drives and sensuality is wrong. I mean, food is meant to taste good. It's just not meant to be so good that you can't stop eating it. Drink is meant to be satisfying, but it doesn't mean you can't stop drinking it. I mean, there's so many things that we can talk about, that there are medications that are created, drugs that are created to help us to ease the pain of difficult times. And we kind of even find that being spoken of in Proverbs, where it says, give wine to those who are suffering. But the idea that we become dependent and these things control our lives is the thing that he says is really demonic and evil. Because in the end of the day, what it says, be filled with the Holy Spirit, not drunken with wine or drunken with any kind of excess, even greed or the love of money, and it goes on and on and on. There are all sorts of things that can capture us sensually. But he says what we're seeking to be is people who are filled with the Holy Spirit. That's why I'm thankful that you're listening to what I have to say. That's why I pray that God will help that you develop that discipline of spending time in the Word every day. But it really makes a difference in how we feel about ourselves, how we interact with the world around us, and how other people feel about us. Because we're called to be witnesses for Christ, even if that means we suffer as a consequence. Well, thanks for the extra time. God bless you. Go in his grace. We'll see you next week.